I recently went to see a production of Tom Stoppard's The Invention of Love, directed by Blanche McIntyre and starring Simon Russell Beale. It's a play about the poet and classicist A.E. Housman and his unrequited love for his friend from undergrad days, set against the backdrop of Oscar Wilde's imprisonment and stuff. If it were written more recently, then that kind of theme would sound so trite and cliched. But the play was written in '97, so that's okay. In fact, the play was bloody brilliant. See, though the emotional heart of the play is about A.E. Housman's unrequited love, the play as a whole is really classics heavy. I'm talking hardcore textual criticism and philology heavy, old school style. So much so that apparently the play caused some wokesters to walk out in protest at its intellectual elitism or something, and I can't recommend this play enough. Now, it's far too late to advertise the current production, but check out the script or any future production if you get a chance. Towards the end, there's a dialogue between the dead or dying Housman and his younger self. They're discussing the Roman elegist Propertius. Side note, one of the secondary themes is about making sense of why Housman abandoned his youthful ambition to do a definitive critical edition of Propertius, and instead dedicated most of his scholarly pursuits to an edition of Manilius. Question, has anyone actually read any Manilius? I can't say that I have. I was thinking about checking him out, but I took one look and was nope. The young Housman claims that Propertius was the first Latin love elegist. Old Housman corrects him. The first of the Roman love elegists was not Propertius, strictly speaking. It was Cornelius Gallus. Only one line of Gallus survived. The rest perished. Virgil wrote a poem for him. How much immortality does a man need? His own poetry all but a line as if he had never been, but his memory alive in a garden in the northernmost province of an empire that disappeared 1,500 years ago. To do as much for a friend would be no small thing. Then the younger Housman recalls that indeed Propertius too mentions Gallus, and then the realization dawns on him. They were real people to each other. That's the thing. They knew each other's poems. They knew each other's girls. Virgil puts it all in a golden age with panpipes and goat herds and Apollo there in person, but you can trust it. That's what I mean. Real people in real love, bearing their souls in poetry that made their mistresses immortal, and it all happened in such a short span, as if all the poetry till then had to pass through a bottleneck where a handful of poets were waiting to see what could be done with it, and then it was over. So that prompted me to do this video on the very poem in which Virgil immortalizes his pal Gallus, Virgil Eclogue 10. Welcome to Ancient Classics. Let's get the backstory out the way first. I'm citing here pretty much straight from the Oxford Classical Dictionary. Gaius Cornelius Gallus was born in 70 BCE or so, making him Virgil's exact contemporary. As a member of the establishment elite, he played a not too trivial role in the tumultuous politics of the time, the era that is between the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar and Octavian/Augustus's rise to and eventual consolidation of power. Gallus served in the military, campaigning for Octavian in Egypt and elsewhere, and was then appointed praefectus of the province of Egypt. Meantime, in his spare time, Gallus wrote poetry, apparently of the very highest order. One poem, Gallus's technical masterpiece perhaps, was a post-Callimacheian etiological poem on the Grynnian Grove, which is alluded to by Virgil's 6th Eclogue. But it seems that most of Gallus's poetry was written in the genre now known as Latin elegiac poetry. As is commonly the case for the genre, Gallus's elegiacs were largely, it would seem, about his or his poetic persona's love for a woman called in the poems Lycoris. Now, according to the 4th century commentator Servius, Lycoris is the poetic pseudonym for a meretrix, that's a courtesan, sex worker, or hooker, depending upon your preferred translation, called Cytheris. As Stoppard's Housman notes, a single line of Gallus's poetry survived, or at least was known to have survived in Housman's time, and it goes, Uno Telures devi ditamne duas, with a single stream, it divides two lands, which is a line quoted by Vibius Sequester, whom I had never heard of till now. So since we don't have much left of Gallus, we have to take his contemporaries and successors' word for his excellence. The entirety of Virgil's 10th Eclogue is devoted to Gallus and his obsession with the licorice or kitharis of his love elegies. This 10th Eclogue is the final poem in Virgil's book of Eclogues, and as you'll see, it has a finality about it that makes it an apt closer. The poem commences thus. Grant me, Arethusa, this my final labour, a short poem for my friend Gallus, which I must recite, and which maybe even Licorice will read. Who'd refuse a poem for Gallus? May not salty Doris intermingle her waters with yours, Arethusa, when you flow beneath Sicilian waves? Since Virgil is writing in the first person, referring to his real-life friend Gallus, it is tempting to view these opening lines as if spoken by Virgil himself, unintermediated by artifice or by any kind of dramatic allusion. That may be so, but that ostensible realism will soon fall away, as we shall see presently. In other words, one can't quite pin down quite how realistically and personally one's supposed to take any of this, and perhaps one's not supposed to. In this opening, Virgil invokes the nymph Arethusa. Now, there's nothing particularly fantastical about this per se. Poets are always invoking goddesses, the muses, for example. Arethusa is a nymph whose two haunts are fountains or springs, one in Sicily, one in Chalcis in Eubea or Evia. Arethusa is wont to travel between the two, hence Virgil's prayer not to let Arethusa's fresh waters get mixed up with the salty sea goddess Doris. I guess the optimal approach would be for Arethusa to burrow down underneath the sea, channel tunnel styly, and travel between her springs that way, but whatever. Virgil's choice of Arethusa as the divine patron of his poem is surely intentional, more than just an excuse to theorize about divine transportation and aqueous contamination. Arethusa, as I just said, resides in both Sicily and Eubea. One of Gallus's influences was apparently an Hellenistic-era poet called Euphorion of Chalcis, from Eubea. Later in this Eclogue 10, Virgil's Gallus will refer to his style of poetry as Chalcidian verse. As for Sicily, well, Sicily was the homeland of Theocritus, the birthplace of the Hellenistic and Roman pastoral, which is the genre of this particular poem. Indeed, Arethusa is evoked by the pastoral poet Daphnis in Theocritus Idyll 1, a poem with a special relevance to this 10th Eclogue of Virgil. So in that regard, Arethusa serves to link the two Roman poets Virgil and Gallus and their respective genres, elegy and pastoral. So Virgil invokes the nymph Arethusa as a proxy muse and asks her to inspire his final labour, extremum laborem, with the word final, extremum, being the very first word of this poem. As he was writing this, Virgil was still a youngish man, so there's no sense that he intends this to be his actual final work, but perhaps it's the last time he'll invoke Arethusa, for perhaps he's already vying to court another goddess, the muse of epic, Calliope, notwithstanding his neoteric/Hellenistic pretenses to humility. But then Virgil transplants himself, and Gallus too, directly into the world of pastoral. Begin. Let us tell of Gallus's anxious love, while the snub-nosed goats graze upon soft shrubbery. We do not sing to the deaf, the woods themselves resound with all our words. Virgil is now speaking as if he is a pastoral goat herd too. Question, are we to imagine the poem as being the direct recitation of Virgil the Roman poet, or are all the words those of an imaginary herdsman character, the kind of character through whom the other eclogues are voiced? Answer, yes. Where were you, naiads? In which woods or glades when Gallus was perishing from an unworthy love? It's not as if the ridges of Parnassus nor of Pindus were causing you to tarry, nor Aganippe of Aeonia. Where were the nymphs when Gallus was perishing? Virgil is here directly channeling Theocritus's first Idyll. I covered the first Idyll in a video back in the day. That poem focuses on the dark, twisted, eroticized and mysterious death of Daphnis. Where were you, nymphs? Where were you when Daphnis was dying? Were you in the beautiful valleys of Peneus or Pindos? And by alluding so obviously to Theocritus 1, Virgil is playing a risky poetic game. By seeking to make so close a connection between the mythic shepherd Daphnis and his mate Gallus, Virgil risks descending into pure bathos. Daphnis, on the one hand, is this otherworldly embodiment of pastoral poetry, one dying from a mysterious, dark, erotic sickness, whereas Gallus, fine poet though he might be, is just feeling a bit put out because his regular hooker is off on campaign or something. The risk that this descends into bathos is certainly there, and it's a bold move on Virgil's part to try to pull it off. But the laurels and the tamarisks wept for him, and pine-clad Menelaus wept for him as he lay beneath a cliff, and so wept the crags of chill Lycaon. Okay, so now we have a sense of location. Menelaus, Lycaon. These are mountains in Arcadia, not Sicily, the haunts of Pan, and though there is no hint of it here, of the human sacrificial / lycanthropic rituals of Lycaon Zeus. But what is Gallus doing in Arcadia anyway? No easy answer here, so we'll continue with the poem. The sheep stand around. They're not ashamed of us, so you shouldn't be ashamed of your herd, divine poet. Handsome Adonis, too, is wont to bring his sheep to pasture by the streams. The shepherd came, and the swineherd came, though belatedly, and Menalcas came, damp from gathering fallen acorns, and they all ask, "Where has your love come from?" Apollo came and said, "Gallus, what is this sadness? Is it another man whom your beloved Lycoris follows across the snow and through the rigours of campaigns?" Sylvanus came, adorned with a rural crown, brandishing flowering fennel and tall lilies. Pan, god of Arcadia, came, he whom we saw ruddy-faced with blood-red berries and red face paint. "Will there be an end to this?" he said. "Love has no concern for such things. Love is no more sated by tears than fields are by irrigation channels, bees by clover, goats by fodder." Oh, so now Gallus is a fully signed up Arcadian shepherd, and like Daphnis in Theocritus 1, the very gods speak to him and inquire as to his predicament, and not without some mystic veiled mockery. But whereas in Theocritus 1 we're never told with whom Daphnis is infatuated, if indeed he is. In that poem there's a sense that Daphnis has rejected or has been unable to respond to would-be lovers, why or for what or whom we just don't know. Here, conversely, with Gallus, we're told who the purported source of his disquiet is. It's Lycoris, the mistress to whom Gallus's real-life poems were dedicated. It seems, perhaps, that Lycoris is following another man on campaign, so Gallus is lovesick, jealous. But this is par for the course for a Latin love elegist. What's the big deal? Why this mythologizing? Again, by drawing so close connections between Gallus and Daphnis, Virgil is playing a risky game. But miserable Gallus said, "But you Arcadians will sing such songs to your mountains. Only Arcadians are skilled in song. How peacefully would my bones rest if your pipes could sing of my love." Now Gallus himself speaks, just as Daphnis does in Theocritus's Idyll 1. Gallus's speech ends in one of the most famous lines in the entirety of Latin literature, and the received truth is that the speech is rife with allusions to and adaptations from Gallus's own real poetry. This at least is what Servius told us, commenting on line 46 and following, "Hi autem omnes versus Galli sunt, de ipsius translatit carminibus." But these are the verses of Gallus carried over from his own poems. Servius, writing as he was in the 4th century, perhaps had access to the copies of the extant poems of Gallus, so perhaps we should take his word for it. But even so, there's no way of proving or testing the extent to which Virgil's Gallus alludes to, adapts from, or even quotes outright the verses of the real-life Gallus, because so little of Gallus's work remains. Now, much of Gallus's poetry, at least that relating to his love affair with Lycoris / Cytheris, would have been written in elegiac couplets, whose verse structure comprises alternating hexameters and pentameters. Eclogue 10, conversely, like all of Virgil's mature works, is written in hexameters. So it is entirely possible that some single lines of this eclogue could have been lifted directly and without adaptation from Gallus, but Virgil could not have quoted consecutive lines without significant adaptation. The meter would not have fit. But even if Virgil could have copied across entire lines of Gallus into this poem, would he actually have done so? I've not seen anyone suggest that, apart from Servius's comment that these verses are carried across, which might be construed as almost like a literal copy and paste. But still, the direct copying of entire lines or passages just doesn't feel Virgilian to me. But perhaps that's just my untested assumptions and preconceptions speaking. Rarely it would seem that serious classical poets quote directly, save perhaps from their own works. But perhaps I just haven't properly tested my assumption here, because just as we've lost most of Gallus's poetry, so notoriously have we lost the majority, I expect, of Greco-Roman poetry anyway. So one can no more prove that Virgil and his peers never quoted entire lines from other poets as we can with any accuracy ascertain the extent to which Virgil quoted Gallus in this poem specifically. Nonetheless, the possibility, however remote, that the words spoken by Gallus in Virgil Eclogue 10 could actually be those of Gallus the real-life poet, they must to some extent be real, even if remote. Bear that in mind for some of this speech's more memorable lines, and so on with Gallus's speech. But I wish I had been one of you, whether a guardian of the flocks, or a cultivator of ripe vines. For sure, whether a Phyllis had been my lover, or an Amyntas, no matter what the passion, what of it if Amyntas's skin is dark? Violets are black, and so are hyacinths. Still, he'd lie with me amongst the willows wrapped with vines. Phyllis would gather garlands, Amyntas would sing, here, Lycoris, the cool springs, here the soft meadows, here the woods, here with you I would grow old. I must admit, I really don't get this bit. So Virgil is imagining Gallus in Arcadia, reciting or singing a song for his absent love interest Lycoris, wishing that he were an actual Arcadian herdsman, and imagining how he'd spend his time with Arcadian lovers Phyllis and Amyntas, while he's also spending time and growing old with Lycoris. This confuses me. Sure, he seems to be fantasizing about a foursome with Amyntas, Phyllis, and Lycoris, but how is that fantasy appropriate for his plea to Lycoris? Of course, she can't hear him because she's off with someone else. And this is all in Virgil's imagination anyway, so fair enough, I guess. But now a mad obsession for brutal war detains me amidst missiles and enemy onslaughts. With you so far from your homeland, if only I could disbelieve such a thing. Without me, you on your own survey the snowy Alps, the chill Rhine. May the chills not harm you. May the harsh ice not cut your tender souls. There's a lot of confusion here, and many people have disputed the text and meaning of that line about a mad obsession for brutal war detaining Gallus. That line has been disputed since Servius's time, or as Clausen puts it, Gallus seems to have forgotten for the moment that he is in Arcadia. Meanwhile, Lycoris is off on campaign somewhere cold, the Alps, or along the Rhine, far from Arcadia and far from real-life Gallus's station in Egypt, or wherever he happens to be. The most common interpretation is that Lycoris is shacked up with some other Roman man off on campaign. Servius posits that that man was none other than Mark Antony. But perhaps not. She is, according to Virgil's Gallus, sola, alone on her expeditions, working perhaps, as Coleman coyly puts it, as a freelancer. Most commentators seem to explain the reference to Lycoris being sola, alone, as a gauche projection of Gallus's own solitude, but we can't put it past Virgil, or Virgil's Gallus, that this is a not too veiled swipe at Lycoris/Cytheris. And I like the idea of Lycoris just following some random Roman campaign, servicing an entire expeditionary force on her own. She could do an OnlyFans feature on it. I shall venture forth, and I shall play songs composed by me in Chalcidian verse, on a reed pipe of a Sicilian shepherd. For sure, I'd rather suffer in the woods amongst the dens of beasts, and carve my love poems upon saplings, and as the tree grows, so shall my love grow. So here, Virgil's Gallus imagines himself living the pastoral lifestyle of an Arcadian herdsman poet, playing a shepherd's pipe while somehow simultaneously reciting Chalcidian verses. Remember earlier how I said one of Gallus's non-pastoral influences was the Chalcidian poet Euphorion. Gallus even imagines himself pursuing that favourite pastime of fictional poetic shepherds, writing poetry on the bark of trees. There's a cute touch here, because by inscribing love poems in saplings, Gallus can imagine the tree growing and the bark maturing, and then therefore the verses inscribed in the tree deepen like a deepening love. But why stop at that? He's going to go on full-on rustic mystic. Meantime I shall wander upon Mount Minorlus amongst the nymphs, or I shall hunt fierce boars. The frost shall not prevent me from surrounding the Parthenian glades with hunting dogs. Already I see myself clambering over rocks, and the groves in which incantations are uttered. It is a joy to shoot Cretan arrows from a Parthian bow, as if this might be the remedy for this passion of ours, as though the god may learn to be more gentle upon human suffering. Shooting Cretan arrows from a Parthian bow. The Cretans and the Parthians were each renowned for their archery skills. So if you're going to go bow hunting and you can afford it, well, it makes sense to get your arrows from Crete and your bow from Parthia. Anyone of a certain age with a certain amount of disposable income who spent a little bit too much on their hobby, like a custom guitar or something, will know what I mean. Now, I'm no hunter, but I bet modern day hunters like to geek out on the latest custom bows and guns, right? So I can totally imagine the real life Gallus or his elegiac poetic persona going off hunting with this custom bow and arrow combo. Indeed, bows and arrows are of course associated with erotic love and love poetry of the elegiac kind, whereas they're not so much associated with pastoral at all. The clue is in the name. Pastoral poetry is about shepherds and stuff, not hunters and sportsmen. So perhaps this is the point at which the illusion cracks, and it does crack. But again, neither the forest nymphs nor even songs are pleasing to me. Once more may the woods be gone. My labours cannot change things, not even if I were to drink from the river Hebrus amidst the frost or endure the Sithonian snows of damp winter. And now, as the withering bark crusts over an elm tree, I may not herd the sheep of Ethiopia under the tropical stars. Love conquers all, and we must yield to love. With that sudden turn, Gallus just admits defeat, surrenders, and the pastoral illusion comes crashing down around him. It's all useless. Gallus is no pastoral herdsman, not even of the fictional kind. Even his imagined inscriptions on young saplings are really just crusty scratches on withered, dried, and rotting bark from dead trees. And Gallus's speech ends with perhaps the most famous Latin hexameter of all time, and one of the most famous quotes in all of Latin literature, second perhaps only to Carpe Diem. Omnia Vincit Amor, et nos cedamus emori. Love conquers all, and we must yield to love. Love conquers all, love conquers everything, and variance thereon has become such a cliché, much like Carpe Diem, I guess. But whilst Carpe Diem has found itself inscribed upon countless bodies, seems like Love Conquers All and its variants have made itself the title of God knows how many cringe pop songs. I searched and listened to a few on streaming, and God, they're awful. No one seems to be able to reduce this. Now, no one can reduce this poem down to a single definitive meaning. We'll come to a few readings presently. But it feels pretty clear here that love conquers everything has no positive meaning here. Nothing to do with true love winning the day, overcoming the odds, and other such cringe. This is about the other kind of conquest. With conquest comes destruction, or at least surrender of the defeated. See, whilst love conquers all things, neuter plural omnia, it's clear that the things thus defeated are not barriers to happiness, not the proverbial bastards that get in one's way. No, it's Gallus, and perhaps Virgil too. We must yield, concede, give way, surrender, kaidomus, to love. And yeah, true, that's partly because I'm reading the subjunctive kaidomus as jussive. We must surrender rather than let's surrender, which, yeah. Whatever. Either which way, the languages of martial conquest, defeat, surrender, and those words are put in the mouth of Gallus, a soldier. Now, if we can just put aside the baggage that inevitably comes with such a line becoming such an overused cliché, we have to admit this is a perfect line, a standalone hexameter, a complete unit comprising two balancing halves, each side of a caesura. So who then wrote this line? I mean, Is it Virgil's own original line, or is he quoting a line from the real Gallus's poem directly? Far as I'm aware, no one says this was written by Gallus. Tellingly, perhaps Servius doesn't suggest it is Gallus's line, and with such a perfect line as this, you'd think Servius would call it out if it were Gallus's. So perhaps I must grudgingly accept that this is likely to be Virgil's original line, smug Virgil. Though he's not the best classical poet, all the best single lines seem to be his. And with that line, Gallus's speech or song is over, and Virgil continues in his own persona, albeit it's as Virgil the imaginary herdsman poet. It'll be sufficient, divine muses, for your poet to have sung such things while sitting and weaving a basket from slender willow. You shall make these the greatest for Gallus. Gallus, love of whom grows by the hour for me, as much as the sapling grows in the early spring. But let's get up and go. Usually nightfall is neither good for singers nor for grazing upon junipers nor for farming. So let's go home, goats, now that you've had your fill. Evening's coming. Thus Virgil signs off and ends his Eclogues. He invokes the Muses, not Arethusa the nymph this time, and he tells of his love for Gallus. His growing affection for him is likened to a growing sapling, referencing back perhaps to how Gallus imagined carving love poems into young trees. And then with night ominously falling, Virgil tells his imaginary goats to get up and go home. There's a lot to unpick in this sign-off, this sphragus or poetic seal if you like, and many have commented on its sense of finality. The motif of a herdsman telling his flock to get a move on as a closural signal is an old one. Theocritus' Idyll 1, which as we have seen is a close model for this eclogue, is an example. Likewise, the motif of dusk falling witness the end of Virgil's Eclogue 1, and it seems a small, insignificant step to combine the two, but thus combined, together with Gallus's professed futility of his attempt to pretend to be a pastoral denizen, well, taken together, most commentators therefore tend to infer a sense of finality here, not just for the poem, but for Virgil's pastoral exploits altogether. In retrospect, we can see that's true, whether this was the original intent or not. Virgil's next works were in the didactic and epic genres. As for Virgil's closing invocation to the Muses, or Divi Pierides as he calls them, well, the Pierian Muses are invoked by Virgil elsewhere in Eclogues 3, 6 and 8. The title Pierides is also used, I think, in Theocritus 2, although Pieria is a region in Macedon, North Greece, not Sicily. Quite what their significance is to Virgil or Theocritus before him, I don't quite know, but as Clausen notes, this is the last time that Virgil will invoke them. Clausen's comments got me thinking. Virgil would go on to write the epic Aeneid, and the ascent of poetic genres from small-scale eclogues to the longer didactic Georgics, and then to the highest, grandest, and most serious form of poetry, epic, is well known, as is the opening line of the Aeneid. Arma virumque cano, I sing of the arms and the man, I sing. It's not until the 8th line of the Aeneid that Virgil calls upon the muse. From the get-go, the Aeneid is Virgil's, almost as if he begrudges the muse. So the seemingly wistful finality of this Eclogue 10 has something of an undercurrent of confidence, even arrogance. Sure, Virgil begs Arethusa at the start of the poem the power to sing a final song, and he bangs on about weaving a basket from slender reeds, an allusion perhaps to the humble and refined craftsmanship of pastoral, which you all know is fake, of course. But perhaps he only bids farewell to the Pierian Muses because he's already planning, as soon as he gets the opportunity, to write an epic for which he intends barely even to pay lip service to the muse. And perhaps I'm being unfair on the still youthful Virgil, but in bidding his pastoral goats to get up and go, he says, Sergamus, let us rise up to loftier heights perhaps. Sorry, I now have inadvertently triggered an image of levitating goats in my mind. So what to make of this poem as a whole? What is the meaning? I'm always skeptical of the idea that one can or should seek to uncover and impose a single meaning on any work of art. We all know it's way more complex than that. But most readings of this poem tend to focus on the interplay between the genre of pastoral poetry and the genre of Latin love elegy, the genre innovated by Gallus, then practiced by Tibullus, Persius, and Ovid, in his earlier works at least. Some readings see the poem as dramatizing or symbolizing a failed attempt by Gallus, perhaps at Virgil's behest, to get over his obsession with licorice/Cytheris by experimenting with a new genre. To quote Coleman, in presenting to Licorice the spectacle of Gallus in Arcadia, Virgil was clearly alluding to a crisis in Gallus's life, both as a lover and as a poet. Possibly Virgil had urged Gallus to escape his troubles by writing pastoral, but Gallus's efforts had been unsuccessful. Whatever he wrote came back to his obsession for licorice and love elegy. The poem would then be Virgil's pastoral exposition of Gallus's predicament, the choice offered to him and his reason for rejecting it. Alternatively, Gallus may already have introduced, perhaps even from the start, pastoral themes into his elegy. Perhaps he was even more of an innovator of the pastoral than Virgil was. Indeed, as Kennedy argues in his 1987 paper Arcadia's Ambo, Virgil, Gallus and Arcadia, the cliches of pastoral were still forming at this time, and there's no real evidence that Arcadia was at this point associated with pastoral poetry at all. Rather, the predominant setting of pre-Virgilian pastoral poetry is Sicily. If therefore we sever the connection between Arcadia and pastoral poetry, then the idea that by placing Gallus in Arcadia, Virgil is poetically transporting Gallus into the genre of pastoral poetry becomes somewhat weaker. Even so, there's still an awful lot of references to herdsmen and stuff. So I think it's hard to argue that Virgil was not on some level artificially imposing the pastoral genre upon Gallus and watching it play out in failure, whatever one might read into that. Then there's the whole question of whether Virgil, real-life Virgil I mean, had a crush on Gallus. I only mention that because it's what's hinted at by Stoppard's Housman, as I described at the start of this video. Now, we all mock the old Victorian and Edwardian translations and commentaries, early Lurbs and the like, for their efforts to ignore blatant elements of homoeroticism in the classics. To quote Stoppard again, there's a really funny passage in The Invention of Love about this, and I'm going to quote it because it's really rather good. In the translation of Tibullus in my college library, the he loved by the poet is turned into a she, and then when you get to the bit where this she goes off with somebody's wife, the translator is equal to the crisis, he leaves it out. So funny and so cringe. But equally cringe in my view is to seek desperately to impose homoerotic undertones into ancient texts without good cause for the sake of it. Efforts to read a sexual relationship between Achilles and Patroclus in the Iliad being the prime example, although at least there was ancient, albeit post-Homeric precedent for that. I don't know what drives this need to infer homoerotic undertones everywhere. My view is that if a man, whether a poet or a character, shows a deep affection for another man, well, sure, he might have a crush, requited or unrequited, or he might just really like him. Frankly, unless it's relevant to the plot of a story or has some other significance, who cares? Can't a deep affection or friendship be enough? In fact, sometimes I actually find the insistence that Achilles must have been fucking Patroclus, else he wouldn't have got so upset about his death, is just insulting to any man who feels an immense sense of pain at the death of his friend or brother. Now, I'm lucky enough not to have experienced that myself yet, but I know people who have, as I'm sure do you, but I digress. So is there any evidence for or contrary to the supposition that Virgil was in erotic love with Gallus? Virgil in his Sphragus, the end of the poem, says that his love, amor, for Gallus will grow like a young tree. Now, amor is not exclusively associated with erotic love, but nonetheless, Virgil's poetic profession of amor does follow on from that Omnia Vincit Amor line, which almost certainly does refer to erotic love. And Suetonius says that Virgil was into boys, though Sweaty Tony, as he shall now be known, says the same about everyone, and Gallus was hardly a boy. Ultimately, I really don't care. So what became of the real-life Gallus? By 27 BC or so, perhaps around a decade after Eclogue 10 was written, Gallus had come under suspicion, as Servius puts it, and was killed, possibly by his own hand. He would have been in his early or mid-40s. By the time of Gallus's death, Augustus had long since won at the Battle of Actium, defeating Antony, whom, if Servius is to believe, may have been Gallus's rival for the services of Cytheris/Licorice. Augustus had thus consolidated his power. If one can speak of the foundation of the Augustan imperial line, or if ever there was a precise point in time at which the former Roman Republic became the empire, then it was around the time or just before Gallus's death. So if it is true that Gallus died as a consequence of coming under suspicion, it's natural to infer that he had come under suspicion of plotting, if not against Augustus himself, then against the Augustan establishment, or so his rivals would have made out. And a fat lot of good his connections with the Augustan establishment and his friendship with Virgil did to help him then. As Sweaty Tony describes events, Augustus did not readily make friends, but he clung to them with the utmost constancy, not only suitably rewarding their virtues and deserts, but even condoning their faults, provided they were not too great. In fact, one cannot readily name any of his numerous friends who fell into disgrace, except Salvidianus Rufus and Cornelius Gallus, whom Augustus had raised to the prefecture of Egypt from the lowest estate. But Augustus forbade Gallus his house and the privilege of residence in the imperial provinces because of his ungrateful and envious spirit. And when Gallus too was forced to undergo death through the declarations of his accusers and the decrees of the Senate, though commending their loyalty and their indignation on his account, Augustus yet shed tears and bewailed his lot, because he alone could not set what limits he chose to his anger with his friends. Conversely, at the time of Gallus's death, Virgil would have finished his didactic poem in 4 books, the Georgics, and would have been working on the Aeneid, i.e. he was a fully paid up member of that same Augustan establishment. Virgil, in other words, was doing just fine, while his friend was allowed to die. Nonetheless, notwithstanding his fall from favour and untimely end, Gallus had built a formidable reputation as a poet. He's referenced not only by Virgil in Eclogues 10 and 6, but also by Propertius and Ovid and maybe Tibullus too. I'll admit it now, I've not read any elegy, say 4 bits of Ovid like 30 years ago. However, like so many other great writers, Gallus's work was lost to posterity. As Stoppard's Housman notes, only a single line survived from ancient times through to the mid-20th century. But then, in the 1970s, a manuscript was literally unearthed at an old Roman fort in Egypt, a site which had narrowly escaped being flooded by Lake Nasser just a few years earlier. Something of an archaeological miracle, right? Amongst scraps of Homer, some random correspondence and stuff, were what are generally believed to be genuine fragments of Gallus's lost poetry uncovered after 2,000 years. Here is Anderson, Parsons, and Nisbet's 1979 edition, which the editors translate as "Sad licorice by your misbehaviour. My fate will then be sweet to me, Caesar, when you are the most important part of Roman history, and when I read of the many gods' temples the richer after your return for being hung with your trophies. At last the muses have made poems that I could utter as worthy of my mistress. The same to you I do not, Whiskers, I do not, Cato, fear, even if you are the arbiter. Tyrion. As for what to make of these fragments, well, if you can excuse this cop-out cum cliché of an ending, my unoriginal and trite sphragus, if you like, that is all for another time. No, wait, actually, my actual real cliched sphragus is, meantime, like and subscribe, ring the notification bell, and we'll be back soon. Shout out to Michael Walton for the original artwork.